The first thing I want to say is that I've just finished reading this book. The Frontline Club sent it to me after I'd agreed to do this, and when it arrived, I thought, oh God, it may be a terrible book, and what am I going to do? In the event, I read it straight through, and it is a fabulous read of magnificent first-person reporting. It is an eyewitness account of the Second Intifada, what's called the Second Intifada in Palestine, from the ground up. I mean, he was there with the kids, with the stone throwers in the street, with the Israeli soldiers. He sees it very well from both sides. I think the book may well be criticized in some quarters for being too critical of the Israelis. However, I think it's an extremely fair book, and it's very well observed. And if you want to know what's happened to the Palestinians and their lives and how their lives have broken down, and also their relationship to the Israelis from 2000, when it all began, until now, I think this is a book that you must read and absorb. David, strangely, I think, gives a lot of credit to Tom Friedman for having written a good book, what he calls a good book, From Beirut to Jerusalem. I think this book is much better, and I think it's much better informed and much more sympathetic and understanding of individuals, both Israeli and Palestinian, in the country. Intifada, as you may or may not know, is an Arabic word that means uprising. The very first Palestinian Intifada was in 1936 against the British, who at that time, the Palestinian, mainly the peasantry, rebelled against the British mandate in Palestine in the hope that they could stop the Jewish immigration, which they knew was going to displace them, because the Zionist leaders said it was their intention to expel the native population and take over, which is ultimately what happened. They've taken up this name again, Intifada, in 1987, when they started another rebellion after the collapse of the PLO in Beirut and the sheer hopelessness of their lives in the occupied territories. They were losing more and more territory being taken for Israeli settlements, more and more people displaced, and very little hope. And the first Intifada was as much a rebellion against the Palestinian leadership, who within a year had co-opted it, as it was against the Israelis. And I believe also the second Intifada was as much a rebellion against Fatah as it was against the Israelis, with Fatah having come to power as this fiction called the Palestinian Authority, and governing very badly and overseeing a 7-year period of relative tranquility, keeping the Palestinians quiet so that the Israelis would be able to steal more Palestinian land and displace more Palestinian farmers. And they rebelled as much against Arafat and his corruption, the corruption of his ministers, as they did against the Israelis. But once again, Fatah rose to the occasion and co-opted that Intifada, and it became very ineffective. And it's now more or less over. But I want to ask David, first of all, what prompted you to write this book now?
Can everyone hear me okay for a start? That's great. I think really what it comes down to, I mean, firstly, thanks very much for very flattering, actually, Charles. But I think you've also hit the nail on the head. What I wanted to do above all else was produce a book which was very accessible. I mean, I think having spent years working in the Middle East as you have, invariably you find people sort of glazing over quite often. There's a new and young generation of people, frankly, for whom the Arab-Israeli conflict remains a bit of a mystery. And the moment you bring up the subject, it's like, you know, it's labyrinthine for them. They don't want to understand the complexities of it. So for me, I think in a way the challenge was actually trying to bring together the diary extracts, the journals, the material that I've had over the last sort of 10, 15, 20 years, and produce a book which wasn't some almighty tome, you know, not something that was intimidating, something that was accessible, readable, but at the same time, hopefully, you know, fairly, you know, a degree of veracity about it in terms of the facts and authenticity. So the real object of the exercise, it's part reflection as well. I had to take stock. And there was no more appropriate time, really, I think, to take stock than in the last year or two, when I think the Palestinian cause, if you like, and the nature of the occupation has moved into a precarious new sort of realm.
Well, you do say towards the end of the book that you could have gone on writing this book forever, because at the end you find yourself in Lebanon in a Palestinian refugee camp last summer, and if you'd waited, you'd have to cover yet another event or another event, so you had to call a halt to it at some stage, or you'd never finish. I also want to say that one of the things you'll like about this book is there are no footnotes. You can read straight through. And although there are notes at the back if you want, it's all very well sourced. There's something I want to read. It's a very interesting quote which I had not seen before. It sort of begins the book. There's a Mark Twain quote that really begins it, but after that there's one. Hold on. It's this. The Palestinian Intifada is a war of national liberation. We Israelis enthusiastically chose to become a colonialist society, ignoring international treaties, expropriating lands, transferring stolen land from Israel to the occupied territories, engaging in theft, and finding justification for all these activities. We established an apartheid regime. Now, what's interesting is that this was said by the Israeli Attorney General, Michael Ben-Yair. Can you explain how that can be? Because he would have been responsible for a lot of this.
Well, I think actually, when I was researching that, it became quite evident that there are many examples, many instances of where Israelis themselves, I think, really just open up and take stock of the situation that they find themselves in. And this is one of them. That he was confronted by the reality of what he was living through, the situation in the occupied territories, and they do find that they have to make these remarks from time to time. It means we take it almost not out of context, but when plucked out in that way, it begins to look very peculiar. It looks like an admission almost of guilt in that sense. And I think that's part of the Israeli psyche as well, increasingly, this terrible turmoil. I mean, the country itself today, I think like no other time perhaps in recent history, I think we're approaching the 60th anniversary next year of the creation of the State of Israel. It's come out of a war in Lebanon with a bit of a bloody nose. The leadership of the country, its credibility has been shot to pieces. There's a lot of self-questioning going on in Israel. I'm not suggesting for a moment that's not always been the case, but I think at this particular juncture, that self-questioning has reached a new pitch in that way. And that sort of quote, I think, and that sort of thought process and facing up to the reality, which is made very tangible, very physical by this separation barrier, security wall, everyone sort of bandies around various terms depending on your politics, that has become a physical manifestation of it. It's interesting that when I use the word apartheid, or if you use the word apartheid, which is commonly used now to describe the situation in Israel and in the occupied territories or in the territories, then there is a huge outcry from Israelis themselves. I think the Hebrew word, forgive me if I don't speak Hebrew, but it's hafrada. I think it means separation, which can be used in terms of a divorce, if you like, but it's entered the lexicon of the Israeli thought process. And when I first wrote about it, actually, not in the book, but in the Sunday Herald, I got this barrage of letters and emails, which I think anyone writing about the Arab-Israeli conflict realizes very quickly, as I point out at the beginning of the book, that nothing is neutral here. And this was the outrage of using this expression, apartheid, to describe the situation there. There is a sort of an awakening, I think, in Israel of the reality, and hence people are beginning to look at potential solutions, if there are any, that maybe 5-10 years ago they would never have contemplated. I mean, the whole idea of a single state binational solution is being bandied around. For many people it seems like cloud cuckoo land, but it's now being thought through and discussed quite openly.
In the book... Popping, oh, thanks. This side wants it close, this side wants it further away. I'd rather... Oh, I see. All right. Is that? I should ask David Sells. He knows about microphones. Does this look about right? It's about right. Okay. My soundman always used to say that too. Okay. Now I forgot what I was going to say. Oh, in the book, your media colleagues come forward quite often in the book because they're covering stories with you. And I want to ask something about media portrayal of this conflict. Recently, since Hamas was elected to government in the Palestinian Authority, Israel said that unless Hamas recognizes the state of Israel's right to exist and renounces violence, it will not have any dealings with it, which is a position that the United States has accepted as well. But no one in the media or indeed in politics has ever suggested a reciprocal recognition that Israel might recognize Palestine's independence and right to exist and renounce violence against Palestinians. Mm-hmm. Why is there no mutuality in terms of coverage and political perception?
I think there's two things here. There's two aspects to this. One is just, again, I use this word mindset a lot. There is an Israeli mindset. I'm fascinated by this kind of Israeli mindset. And I think the reason I bring it up is because it filters down. It feeds into the way in which our coverage is handled. Israel is extremely good at putting out this no-compromise perspective in that way. I mean, I think it's amazing in the last week. Here we are already talking about peace proposal, peace initiatives, the Arab summit in Riyadh and whatever. I mean, Condoleezza Rice in the last few days talking about the need for Arabs to reach out to Israel. I mean, what an extraordinary statement that was. I mean, not only there's a refusal to recognize the unity, the government there, the Americans continuing to arm elements within Fatah, at the expense of Hamas, the Israelis bombing Lebanon, and yet Condoleezza Rice insists that somehow Arabs should reach out to Israel. It's this absolutely uncompromising position that constantly comes through. I think our own coverage, I think as journalists now, it's interesting that by and large, now, I'm happy to take criticisms from the floor on this, but I think by and large our media colleagues are to a great extent sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. Now, in the early part of the book, I freely admit to that. I freely admit to the fact that I'm not impartial. For two reasons. One, I think it's impossible to present impartiality. I know that from the mailbag that I get. There is no neutrality on this issue. And the second is simply that as a thinking, intelligent person, it's impossible to visit the region or to visit that part of the world and not feel that a fundamental injustice is being perpetrated. It does amaze me that that is not, I think, handled more in our coverage. I think there's an element of fear almost amongst journalists. The Israeli authorities have become very strict in the last few years. The censorship has extended, the restrictions and access, not only to the movement of Palestinians, but to reporters themselves, I think, is impacted quite dramatically in the way we cover the conflict itself.
Have you ever had problems with your editors in Scotland with stories you filed?
It's a good question. I've never had problems with my editors in Scotland. I think what is extraordinary, and I suspect if there are journalists in the audience here, they'll probably have encountered this, is this phenomenal lobby that comes trundling forward whenever you criticize Israel. It's usually inextricably tied up with accusations of anti-Semitism, this great bogey of anti-Semitism. I, as a foreign editor of the Sunday Herald, have had regular visits, invitations to speak with representatives from the Israeli embassy, from representatives of the Jewish community. I know of no other community that actually does this, that will stir up a lobby, a barrage of, frankly, vitriolic emails and criticism whenever your newspaper dares step over the line as they see it. Now, that doesn't take much quite often. And I think that also is an inhibiting process in the way journalists operate. They are being censored on a whole variety of levels. There's physical access in the country. There's a fear of upsetting their editors. There's a fear of stirring up a hornet's nest amongst the Jewish community, not just in this country, but worldwide. The Sunday Herald is based in Glasgow in Scotland. You should see the mailbag that we get from New York. It's extraordinary. Absolutely phenomenal. And I think these are all crucial factors in the way the coverage is actually molded.
With that in mind, I'd like to take questions from the floor if anybody has either read the book or wants to read the book and wants to know more. Please.
Please wait for the mic.
If you could identify yourself first.
My name is Chris Wangler. I was sound technician and working on a lot of documentaries and a producer of documentaries for a while. No, one of the charges that they level against anyone who mentions the word apartheid. But how do you respond if you or have you thought of just saying, well, both Nelson Mandela and Bishop Desmond Tutu, both who have very, very personal experience of what apartheid is about, and therefore probably are the best critics to be able to make a comment, have quite categorically stated that it is apartheid?
I think the term, the reality of the term apartheid is there for everyone to see. There's a lot been written about this. There's a lot been written. I think that the Guardian newspaper itself, last year I think it was, did a whole series of articles drawing parallels and the relationship between South Africa and Israel. Not just in terms of the way the regime operates, but certain historical links and connections and whatever. It's very interesting. You mentioned, Nelson Mandela, but I think it's Nelson Mandela who's referred to Marwan Barghouti as being a kind of his equivalent, really, in the Middle East in that way. Of course, Barghouti's son, as you may be aware, was released himself from prison, I think only last week, but Marwan Barghouti continues to serve these 5 life sentences. The physical separation of Israelis and Palestinians is undoubtedly apartheid. There are 700 kilometres of wall which are testimony to that. There are pass laws, there are restrictions on movement. I'm sure most of us are all familiar with the absolute litany of conditions that are imposed on Palestinians. What is it if it's not apartheid? What is it? But somehow, when you speak to many Israelis about this, the very word, for obvious reasons, conjures up a hateful and disgusting regime or ideology, and they're quick to put it down. But the reality, unfortunately, is something very, very different.
Hi, I'm Kate Clark, freelance journalist. I had 2 questions. One, what was your thoughts about Alan Johnston, who's kidnapped? And secondly, based in London, it seems as if it's become the press and the broadcasting media, particularly the broadcasting media, has actually become more conservative when it comes to criticising Israel or reporting news in such a way that could be considered critical to Israel. Is that what you'd think?
I'll take the Alan Johnson.
Why?
Yeah, I'll take the Alan Johnson thing first. I mean, I've met Alan. I think, like most journalists, we're now extremely concerned about what's happened. I think there's been concern growing in Gaza for some time. The great fear, of course, is that kidnappings in Gaza would result perhaps in a fatality or an execution. For some time now, there's been a number of kidnappings going on there. The general view would be that within a few days it would be resolved. The internal dynamics and the political machinations that go on behind the scenes that we are often not party to would work it out. Indeed, I think Hamas themselves made it quite clear in the early stages that they were aware of who the kidnappers were and that movement dialogue was afoot to actually do something about that. But as time passes, it's more and more worrying. I think it's also, if I can just dwell on that for a moment, indicative of the problem that is the Gaza Strip at the moment, and there lies a sort of key linchpin, I think, in the current sort of situation. The last time I was here in the Frontline Club, we discussed at some considerable length the potential for a civil war in Gaza. At that stage, there were considerable numbers of clashes on the streets in Gaza between Fatah and Hamas itself. And it's worrying that really what is effectively happening there is a proxy war being conducted by the United States of America. I mean, there have been a number of commentators who've written about this recently. The United States, with Israel, has been supplying arms, weapons to Mahmoud Abbas's units within the Gaza Strip. I think recently something like 8, since I think it was last October, 8 trucks full of AK-47s, millions of rounds of ammunition have made their way from Israel into the Gaza Strip and been distributed there. Likewise, I presume Hamas have their own way of getting their weapons as well. From an American perspective, it's seen as this proxy army. It's this big battle against Islamofascism. It doesn't matter whether they're doing it in Somalia or in Lebanon or wherever. They're using militias as a proxy war here. And to a greater extent, I think Mahmoud Abbas and others in Gaza, within the Palestinian Authority, within Fatah, are now falling in line and becoming just simply mouthpieces of unbelievably, of Israeli and American policy within the region itself. I think your second point about this conservatism, if you like, that the media has become perhaps a little bit more conservative in its criticism of Israel. One of the great difficulties at the moment is that the Palestinians themselves, as a people, I think, have I think, as I described it last time I was here, they're burying the hatchet in each other's backs at the moment. They've taken their eye off the ball here. They've given the advantage, the initiative, if you like, to the Israelis, to the occupation. And I think in that respect it's made it more difficult for many journalists who perhaps would write about the nature of the occupation in a certain way and be critical of it, to be as critical, because the Palestinians themselves appear at face value recently to be incapable of actually sitting down, working out a cohesive strategy on a wider regional level or a local level, and ensuring that they don't end up at each other's throats as they've been increasingly doing. And I think that's created problems for journalists, and it's allowed, I think, many journalists to focus in a different way on the problem and perhaps be less critical of Israel. Israel has just simply sat back a little bit at the moment. If you look back to the Eilat bombing, I think, in January, now there was an uncharacteristically muted response from Israel at that time. Why was that? It was simply because Fatah and Hamas appeared to be doing each other enough damage without Israel wading in there with a big stick and bringing them once again together against a common enemy in that way. I think the Israelis are getting it easy in the press at the moment, frankly, for a number of reasons such as those.
What do you say? I'd like to get another question, but until someone comes forward, I won't ask one myself. Oh, David, please. No. It's not a question. What do you say about the Americans arming Fatah? This has been going on for some time now, and it's escalated. But interestingly, speaking of proxy wars, Saudi money and American help are going very strongly into Lebanon to arm the anti-Hezbollah factions, the Druze, the Sunnis, and others, and when they're really setting the stage for a resumption of the Lebanese civil war. Again, not necessarily in the best interests of the Lebanese people, or indeed of the Palestinian or Israeli people, what they're doing there. But in any case, I'll take a question now from David Sells.
Yeah, it's very simple, really. I just wonder, Israel's coming up to its 60th birthday, and I wonder to what degree what we are seeing and have seen for many years in the West Bank and Gaza is a symptom of a normalization of a nation state, which we are seeing, having forgotten, although they're using it all the time, the Holocaust type of thing, rather the Russia with the Chechens and things like that. Israelis handling this difficult people here in our land. I just wonder whether what we are seeing, in fact, is a sort of rather cold-blooded normalization of a state.
Well, I don't know if it's a normalization of the nation-state, but it's certainly cold-blooded, that's for sure. I actually believe, David, that in many ways, I mean, it's been indicative for some time that the Israeli leadership, I mean, we were talking downstairs before we came up, we were talking about Ariel Sharon and the demise of Ariel Sharon. I actually think the Israeli leadership are out of kilter, completely out of kilter with the feelings of ordinary Israelis themselves. I mean, Lebanon was a testing point on that. If you talk to most ordinary Israelis, they are still determined that separation is the best guarantee of security at the moment in that way. We, meanwhile, I think particularly the Quartet and certain European nations are still talking about a two-state solution, while in a third analysis, people are talking about this single state, binational state as well. No one seems to have any cohesive strategy here at the moment. I don't know what you mean by a normalization of it. I mean, how can that be normal? Admittedly, the terms and conditions, if I can put it that way, of the region, as an Israeli friend of mine once said, you've got to understand the neighbourhood rules here, David. They're very different from elsewhere. So perhaps in that sense, what Israel does is normal by Israeli standards, but it's certainly not normal by any international standards of human rights or policy.
Well, I would say ask President Putin what he thinks about it.
Well, two wrongs don't make a right.
Well, no, but I'm making the point that this is what happens with nation states, that it can be very bloody-minded, and perhaps we should ask the Reverend Ian Paisley about that, about the last 40 years. Could I just ask one follow-up, Charles? How much do you think, Israelis 10 years ago, Peace Now had a huge following, and sort of something like 60% of Israelis were, for a peace mission and solution. Now that has shrunken terribly, and to what degree are the Palestinians themselves, with their suicide bombings and things like that, responsible for making frightening is the ordinary Israeli?
Let me explain something. I remember a year or two ago, I was staying at a hotel many people here may be familiar with if they've been in that neck of the woods, the Jerusalem Hotel near Damascus Gate in East Jerusalem. And it's run by a Palestinian Christian family. And there'd been over a space of a week or so a spate of suicide bombings. And we were talking one evening after dinner and, about the situation. And they were saying to me, look, David, it's simple. This is abhorrent. But, no one ever pays any attention unless we do this kind of thing. I think the suicide bombing campaign, and I mean, it gives great sort of strength to the argument that the separation wall and barrier, every Israeli will tell you, see, it works. It actually works. You see, suicide bombings are down. There's a complex set of reasons for that. It's not just simply the existence of the wall itself. But I think Israelis themselves, there has been a sort of demise of the Israeli left, the progressive Israeli component, as you rightly point out. I think, again, this mindset thing, they've just simply felt themselves entrenched, resigned themselves to the current climate, to this apartheid, this separation process that is ongoing at the moment. They're devoid of leaders that actually show any initiative, that seem willing to engage in any peace process or dialogue. They've, in a sense, just given up on that. I mean, I think that's one of the most worrying elements to it. On the flip side, of course, as we've just mentioned, you have Palestinians battling Palestinian. You have, polls showing that, most Palestinians are keen on the idea of a single state now, according to many polls. But at the same time, they, if asked, would actually say that they understand Hamas's reluctance to recognize the existence of the State of Israel. We're in this twisting, convoluted, labyrinthine world at the moment. At least I think when Ariel Sharon was around and things were a bit more straightforward, a them and us situation, it's become much muddier, greyer, and very worrying. How that will be unravelled, I think, is the great challenge at the moment. I'm not really optimistic that the summit in Riyadh will be such a whirlwind start to that process.
Any other questions? At the back, please. Oh, sorry, I'm sorry.
Hi, Mary Moran. I'm an artist and a poet and don't really know a lot about this except the impressions I've picked up over the years. And I'm wondering how much is or am I right in saying, how much is the lack of self-determination in cultural confidence? I mean, billions have gone into supporting the Palestinians over the years, and Hamas is having a problem with that having been withdrawn to some extent and so forth recently. How is it that the Palestinians over 60 years haven't created an internal culture that in some way would contradict the possibility of apartheid, the sense of being quite powerful, strong, creative, something to say, I'm more than a victim, I'm more than backing suicide bombing, number one. And if you don't mind, number two, Islamofascism seems to be, at least on the surface, blaming this difficulty for its desire to reestablish a caliphate around the world. How do you, and a lot of people believe this, how do you see that connection, or do you just, what do you think of that? What's that?
Well, let me take the cultural question, if you like, first. I think Palestinian culture is alive, thriving, and well. I think it does so despite the circumstances. I'm actually, frankly, always amazed at just how energetic and dynamic it actually is. Visit Ramallah, visit the cultural centres, talk to artists, writers, poets, painters. There is still a thriving Palestinian culture. The fact that it continues to operate under such an occupation is always mind-boggling for me, absolutely mind-boggling. I think it's very difficult to move, to create a confidence, if you like. Palestinians they've had the confidence knocked out of them. That's what occupation does. This constant, this protracted, prolonged grinding down of these people.
I mean, I'm an Arab, so I'm, myself, but the Jews around the world, have been exterminated and in every way have had that kind of negativity imposed on them. Nevertheless, they tend to be able to...
Just Germany and Eastern Europe.
No, of course that's true about the Holocaust. I'm talking about the negativity imposed on them elsewhere.
Let's get the data correct, please.
Well, please continue.
Thank you, my lord.
But I mean, the Jews have had such an excruciating situation around the world too, and nevertheless they come forward with quite large successes.
Historically familiar with that. I mean, it's not for the first time that we hear this reasoning that somehow someone once said to me, Israel is a bit like sort of an abused child that becomes the abuser in that way. Again, it's some kind of bizarre twist in mindset. I really think that the Palestinians at the moment are probably at the lowest ebb that they have been for some considerable time, simply because they are bereft of a leadership, a serious leadership that can show them a sense of direction, place and purpose at the moment. Potentially the only man capable of that is banged up in an Israeli jail doing 5 life sentences. Speak to many Palestinians about how, not all of course, but how they view Marwan Barghouti. And they will tell you that here was a man, I mean, I've interviewed him, I've met him on many occasions, dynamic, intellectual, realistic, pragmatic, and capable of moving things forward and indeed getting some sort of dialogue going if it's possible. Instead, we have, at the moment, within the Palestinian leadership, strategies and moves, as Mahmoud Abbas did in the last week or two, of appointing someone like Mohammed Dakhlan as the new security advisor. Now, if that's not red rag to a bull in this situation and really myopic, then I don't know what is. And, it's understandable then that Palestinians, ordinary Palestinians, throw their hands up in despair and say, where are we going when we've got people like Mahmoud Abbas, who's meant to be a leader, making such an error of judgment in that way? Of course, and in a way it brings me on to your second question about Islamofascism, because Mahmoud Abbas has become, as we said earlier, a tool, a proxy, a device by which Israel and the United States are increasingly able to exert their influence over the region itself. They are the bulwark against Hamas. They are the bulwark against what the neoconservative lobby in the United States sees as Islamofascism. It's not unique, as Charles said a moment ago. It's happening in Lebanon. It's been happening in Somalia. It happens in Pakistan. It happens in Afghanistan. They're using proxies everywhere in this respect. So, it's doubling the layers of grief and problems on the Palestinian people themselves. The main issue is they don't have leadership at the moment. They don't have a credible leadership. Neither do the Israelis, frankly.
There's a question at the back.
Isn't it true?
Could you identify yourself?
Richard Young. Isn't it true that America's foreign policy in the Middle East is being run by Israel through the 80 million Christian Zionists in America and the 6 million Jewish Zionists? Because nobody can get elected in America unless when you look at Senator Charles Percy lost his job because he mildly criticised Israel. Senator Paul Finley lost his job because he mildly criticised Israel. Senator William Fulbright lost his job as a senator because he mildly criticised Israel. Since then, no American politician can get elected if he doesn't go along with what Israel wants. I mean, that is why Israel gets more than $4 billion a year. It's one of the smallest countries in the world, one of the richest countries in the world in its standard of living, and yet it gets 40% of America's total foreign aid budget. And the reason is because the American-Israeli Public Affairs Committee makes sure that anybody who stands for the American Senate or the House of Representatives who dares to criticise Israel even mildly, AIPAC and other organisations, American-Israeli Public Affairs Committee and the Zionist lot and the Christian Zionists will make sure that the opponents will get all the money they need and they won't get money.
I'm going to cut you short. Could you just direct a question?
So what I'm saying is that hasn't Zionism corrupted American politics to such an extent that you know.
I think where it's corrupted it certainly has a profound influence on it. And indeed, you've just outlined it yourself. I mean, the IPAC, APAC, I mean, is a hugely powerful lobby in that sense. I'm always amused. Indeed, I make this reference in the book to the T-shirts, which you may have encountered if you've ever been down in East Jerusalem, where they had a sort of logo of an American F-16. You could buy them in Palestinian or Arab shops in the old city, which had this sort of slogan on it that said, "Don't worry, America, Israel is behind you," not the other way round, And I remember a friend of mine saying, that's an interesting slate. They've got that wrong. I says, no, I suspect they've got it very right, actually, And it's absolutely true. I mean, there are many references, again, in the book to, occasions when policy, everybody knows. I mean, Israel, right, I think Ariel Sharon made a famous remark about, don't worry about American policy because we write it for them anyway, or words to that effect. It's a huge, huge lobby. The shame, of course, is in Europe's positioning in all of this. The position of the quartet here in Europe, the fact that we seem to have kowtowed to so much of that decision making and manipulation and not been more vociferous, with the possible exception of Mr. Putin's Russia, of course, for reasons best known to themselves. I think it's shameful that Europe hasn't made its voice clearer and better heard. Although recently I noticed Norway has stepped out of line in that one. If you remember after Hamas were elected, I think it was Saeb Erekat, made the remark that, the election results, we woke up that morning and the sky was a different colour. I've often wondered what he meant by that. Did he mean that it was a clear blue sky and here we go from here, everything can only get better? Or did he mean that, there are massive thunderclouds on the horizon here? The tragedy is, and again Palestinians and indeed many Lebanese will tell you this, and indeed said that to me when I was there, indeed and Charles was there last year when Israel was bombing Lebanon, is that we try democracy your way or the American way. I mean, shortly before Israel was bombing Lebanon, George Bush was talking about it being a great example of, democracy in the Middle East. We run democratic elections, or democratic elections are run, but the results don't suit Washington. You can't have democracy, have results you don't like, and then clobber people for doing that. And, so many Palestinians will say, what do you want us to do?
This is an old theme in American history. Woodrow Wilson, during one of his many invasions of Latin America, said, we will teach them to elect better leaders. Question in the back there. Sorry, against the wall. But after you. Please.
James Bailey-Smith. I'm a documentary filmmaker. Correct me if I'm wrong here, but is it not the case that the European Union is the biggest trading partner of Israel, and as a result they could exert quite a significant influence?
Exactly, and it just completely relates to what this gentleman at the back was saying a moment ago. And I do think it's shameful that they don't exert the political influence and clout that they have at a whole raft of levels, frankly. They could really have made themselves heard over the sanctions that were being imposed on the Palestinian Authority. It's absolutely shameful.
Phil Jacobson.
Hello, Philip Jacobson, Old Middle East Hand, and the recipient of many a rude email from Sunday Times readers. We've been talking about the Washington-Tel Aviv, the Washington-Jerusalem axis. What about our own wonderful government here? Does it exert any influence? If so, is it for the good, for the bad, or are we just, as usual, going along in the trail of Mr. George?
I think the short answer to that is that we are going along in the trail of Mr. George. I was talking to a colleague of mine at the Sunday Herald about the just digress slightly for a moment about the current sort of crisis in Iran over the hostage situation, the British captives. If you think about it, a few years ago, 2004, when a similar situation arose, Jack Straw was at least able to lift the phone and telephone someone in Tehran and sort of get some sort of dialogue going and sort of resolve the situation. We had the last vestiges of a sort of individual, shall we say, British foreign policy perhaps in the Middle East, albeit that even at that stage it was inextricably tied up with the United States. That's proving a bit more difficult on this occasion for a number of reasons, partly to do with the regime in Iran itself, but also I think largely because we have, hitched, our wagons to that particular Washington horse. I mean, that has happened undoubtedly. I think Britain would like to do more about the Arab-Israeli conflict, but I think going back again to what we were saying, such is the power of the lobby in the United States, the Zionist lobby. I think, as Jason Burke in a review of my book actually pointed out, I refer to it as the Jewish lobby, and he rather rightly pointed out as the Zionist lobby, and I absolutely stand corrected. He's right on that one. Such is the power that I think Britain, in a sense, is neutered.
Question here in the front, near the front.
Yeah, I'm interested in...
Could you identify
yourself? Sorry, François Duranton. I work in the city. I'm interested in the power of the media. You mentioned about the sort of Jewish lobby. What about the journalist lobby? I mean, you've mentioned that actually, I assume you're talking about European journalists, or probably a lot more pro-Palestinian. What is the situation in Israel and in America compared to that, and the influence they have on people living there? And are there any dissenting voices over that?
I think, as David Sells was saying earlier on, there has been a demise, I think, of certain progressive voices and groups within Israel. But, they are still there. There are wonderful newspapers, there are wonderful correspondents, and you pick up Haaretz and you think, thank God, someone actually, there is a voice of sanity in amongst certain sections of Israeli society. These people are there, and there are many fabulous Israeli journalists who take a position which is very different from that their country would perhaps like them to take. I think it's true that political pressures, national political pressures, be you European, be you American, be you Israeli, obviously temper, shape, mould the coverage that a reporter is likely to provide in that way. I'm more worried, frankly, about the capacity for non-reporting or restricted reporting that will be happening. we mentioned Alan Johnson earlier on. Alan was one of a few people, I think he's been there 3 years in Gaza. He's one of the last journalists for a major network to be in Gaza for that length of time. What happens if people begin to leave, no correspondents get into Gaza, the Israelis make it impossible for them to go there, indeed the Palestinians make it impossible themselves? My biggest fear is for an even tighter restriction on reporting. In answering your question, I think national identities mould to some extent the nature of the reporting of this conflict. The American press invariably, particularly newspapers like the New York Times, takes a particular line. The Guardian here might take a different one. That goes without saying. But it's the restriction more than anything else that's a cause for concern.
Question here.
Mohammed Hussain, I'm a PhD student looking at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I was quite interested when you said that the Palestinians need a strong leadership. I was just wondering what would that even achieve, even if they had one? If you look at what the Palestinians have done, for example, they went to The Hague and they got the decision on the separation wall/fence, yet Israel just ignored that. The world community didn't do much about it. So even if there was a strong leader, if Israel is holding most of the cards, including who can campaign where in the last Palestinian elections, what will this leader achieve? It's quite a negative scenario, but what does it matter how strong the Palestinian leader is if other people are not engaging?
Israel does hold most of the cards, undoubtedly. There's no question about that. But that doesn't remove the responsibility on behalf of the Palestinians. When I was last here in the Frontline Club with a delegation or a panel which were representative of certainly the Palestinian community here, and I think almost to a person, despite we had quite a cross-section from representatives from Fatah, from Hamas, they themselves realized that while Israel holds the cards, it is incumbent upon the Palestinian people, the Palestinian leadership, to find some way of restoring their credibility, of getting back on a platform. I'm not suggesting for a moment that it's a sort of, it will resolve all the problems. But for goodness sake, how can we expect any dialogue to begin when energies at the moment in the Palestinian community are being used and expended to cut each other's throats in this way? I refer back again to the appointment of Mohammed Dahlan, a man who is hated and vilified, and has strong links with well-known links with Israel and with the United States, links with the CIA, who is brutal, who has cracked down on Hamas, who polarizes the community. Until a leader can emerge or be brought through in some way. I refer again to Marwan Barghouti, but he's in jail at the moment. That's the tragedy. Israel holds the cards, but it is incumbent upon the Palestinians themselves to start shouldering responsibility and coming up with a sense of strategy and policy that's clear, directed, and throws the ball back towards the international community and to Israel itself.
Question here.
Martin Short, aging hack.
And well-known documentary maker.
Thank you very much. Just two questions. Do you think Tony Blair should apologize to the Palestinians for the Balfour Declaration? And as a Scot, do you think the United Kingdom has a right to exist?
Well, actually, if you don't mind, I'll take your second question first, because it was a subject of some debate downstairs. And indeed, it is interesting, because we were talking about, nation states, the breakup of nation states, identity, all of these issues in that way. Scotland's facing that in the next month or so. You just have to pop up to Glasgow or Edinburgh at the moment to realise how fierce the debate actually is. And it will get worse. I mean, remember, it is the anniversary of the Act of Union coming up just around the same time as the election itself. So the gloves are off. I personally am not going to divulge what my particular political viewpoint is on the question of independence. But moving swiftly to Tony Blair, well, I suspect that Tony Blair rarely apologises for anything, least of all the Balfour Declaration.
I remember in 2002 he came to see Yasser Arafat in Gaza on Balfour Day, which the Palestinians were not celebrating very enthusiastically, and they didn't celebrate his arrival there on that day very enthusiastically either.
Well, again, I mean, in a way, anecdote as that might be, it's symptomatic, I think, of the clumsiness with which so much of our foreign policy and the way in which our leaders conduct that foreign policy in the Middle East. If there ever was a bull in a china shop, that is exactly it. I mean, I digress slightly, but during a year or so ago, we did the first elections in Iraq, and I was embedded with American forces, and I remember actually going into a place up in near Bakuba, and we were delivering ballot boxes for the election, and we arrived, and it was a Friday, and the officer in charge of the unit, when I mentioned to him that, this is it's Friday, and, Muezzin was called to prayer, and the shutters were coming down, and it was rather tense. And having spent a year in the country, he said to me, "What's the significance of Friday? I don't understand. And I just thought it was, it's a small story, but it was indicative of just how ignorant I think, we often are about these regions and how we go in sort of heavy-booted and footed into situations. And frankly, our leaders are no different. I mean, they don't seem to learn at all."
Yes, please, just here.
Hi, David. Richard Parr from Press Wire here. I'm just interested to know your thoughts on the BBC holding back on its audit, objectivity audit from the region of reporting in the Middle East.
Well, again, it's a bit of a subject we were talking about downstairs. Objectivity, journalism, is a massive, massive issue in that way. I think the BBC should be questioned over a variety of issues with regards to this. I suspect also they're obviously being very careful at the moment. We refer back to Alan Johnson as well. It's a difficult one. And in relation to the Arab-Israeli conflict, it will always be difficult. It will always be difficult. I don't actually subscribe to the idea necessarily of that kind of objectivity. Again, as I say in the book, impartiality. I mean, does it exist? What is it? I mean, I'm curious about this as a journalistic debate. And in a way, the Arab-Israeli conflict is perhaps one which, more than any other, highlights that very issue. For a major network like the BBC, it has to move carefully. But I'm also interested in how that percolates down to individual journalists themselves on the ground. And I do see colleagues, almost taking note of the way whether it be, as Kate was saying, a sort of certain conservative move towards reporting or whatever, taking note of this and almost towing the line in that sense, it is worrying. I disagree with it, basically. I disagree with the BBC's sort of position on it.
It seems that they're particularly fearful of upsetting the Israelis.
I think they are. I mean, the Israelis, this gentleman used the expression, the Israelis hold all the cards. I mean, they invariably hold all the cards, not just in terms of policy or of strangling the Palestinians through the occupation process, but, they do turn the tap on and off with regards to the access and how you function and operate as a news network or as an individual journalist within the country itself. If I write a book like this and I return to Israel, I don't know how it will be received. I would like to think that it is fairly balanced, although
you'll have very big audiences among certain sectors of Israeli population. They would love the book.
But will it backfire?
That will not be officialdom, no.
Well, of course. And will it backfire? And will it mean that when I turn up at Ben Gurion Airport that things will be made even more difficult than they are already? I think every journalist, whether you be writing a book or indeed, just writing news reports or features there or filming, you're conscious of this. You're conscious that you seem to become an activist in a way, and there's a treacherous area there which I think the Israeli authorities themselves are constantly on the lookout for the journalist who just steps over the line that little bit too far and they come down like a ton of bricks on them. And I think that influences our coverage enormously from top to bottom.
Any other question? Oh, another question? Oh, sure. Well, this is David Sills, formerly of the BBC, until very recently.
I left the BBC last year after 40 years as a reporter with them. I did what? Yeah, but I worked for Newsnight for the last 26 years, covering the Middle East and Europe, and I must say I disagree with you when it... No, but I'm just making the point that the BBC, as I found it, in my time working in the Middle East, I was not pressured by editors or, senior executives to toe the line. Sure, as David and Charles say, you're always going to get problems with the lobbies and all the rest of it. And in this sense, the Israelis are, very shrewd the way they operate. But you resist, and if you're going there, as David and Charles have done over the years, you know the score. But you do your stuff, and I don't think the BBC, in my experience and watching it as it's turning out now, is actually genuflecting, bending the knee to the Israelis in this sense.
David, do you think that the BBC should release this report, this internal report on their coverage of Israel?
I didn't even know there was one.
No. This is what the controversy is about. They prepared an internal report last year. They want to keep it secret. Under Freedom of Information Act, people are trying to get them to release it, and they're resisting in the courts.
Oh, well, that's stupid. In that case, they should release it, because transparency is always the best defense on these occasions. And if it's a rubbishy report, then you just say, sorry, rubbishy report. But no, release it.
Transparency is important, but it's interesting to take note of just what pressure has been brought to bear that has created this situation. As I say, it operates from the individual reporter to the very top in that way. I am very, very increasingly conscious of it whenever I return to Israel. Is this the time where they're just going to object? It's like the old closed military zone catchphrase, catch-all phrase that the Israelis use when you're operating there, when you try to gain access to the territories whenever there was any trouble or whatever. It's closed military zone. You can't come here. That's it. You don't need an explanation for that. Is that going to extend, or is it increasingly extending to the point where you just can't get into the country at all because of a remark, a sentence, a phrase, the use of a certain term, a criticism that you've written in one report or whatever? It is a constant balancing and juggling act. And it's increasingly difficult because I believe, as I said at the beginning, that the State of Israel has a case to answer for in its treatment of the Palestinian people. And no intelligent and, reporter can ignore that. But you do so with great risk involved in returning to the country.
Many other questions? This gentleman.
Hi, Chris Keegan, games developer. I just wanted to take, this is labyrinthine for me. One of the things that I have a lot of trouble with is understanding more about Hamas. I'd like to get you to elaborate a bit more about that, because I sense a frustration with Fatah and Mahmoud Abbas, but I don't really see, I can't get beyond the kind of the refusal to recognise the state of Israel for Hamas. I'd like to know a little bit more about that and your views.
I mean, there is a reference I made in there as well, which in the book to the fact, Hamas is some people say a bit of a Frankenstein creation, that that in a sense Israel were in part responsible for the creation of Hamas. It was a great sort of counter to the dominance of Fatah at one time. Like any Frankenstein monster you create, it comes back to haunt you somewhat. If you're asking why Hamas has this refusal to recognise the existence of the State of Israel, there are long, protracted historical reasons for that. But also, I think, in a more contemporary vein, Hamas has found, especially when it came to the forefront, that it tapped into the psyche of the street, and particularly in Gaza in a way. I mean, Hamas's success has as much to do, I think as Charles alluded to earlier, with the failures of what is termed the old guard, the old corrupt Palestinian leadership, who appeared to be in it for themselves. And along came this organisation, albeit with a very different religious and arguably political take from mainstream Fatah and the old guard, the Tunisians, as they're sometimes called, and caught the imagination of a new generation of young Palestinians. To suggest, though, that Hamas has gripped their imagination to the extent that Palestinians across the board are committed to them, I think would be pushing it a little bit too far. The vote in their favour was as much a vote against the corruption of Fatah as it was an ringing endorsement of Hamas itself. Massive challenging questions for Hamas now, because they are now boxed into a corner. Where do they go from here? It's a hugely difficult position for them. And they are, of course, geographically limited in their influence. They are predominantly strong in Gaza. They don't have that quite the same ringing endorsement in other parts of the West Bank. So it is problematic for them. But I can't see them budging any more than I can see Israel budging. So it's difficult. And this is why I think the need for a fresh leadership, someone to emerge from the sidelines or within the movement itself that can somehow cut their way through this labyrinth and get the thing back on course and get the sides talking again.
Philip Knightley.
Thank you. Philip Knightley, freelance writer. What has happened to Mordecai Vanunu? And two, was he correct? What is your personal assessment of Israel's nuclear capability? I mean, does it have the bomb?
I think undoubtedly it does have the bomb. If I can only explain in one simple sentence, and it's a remark that was made to me during the first Gulf War, as it was known, when Iraqi Scud missiles were sort of raining down on Tel Aviv. And I remember being at a press conference in the Tel Aviv Hilton, and one of the journalists in the audience asked the IDF spokesperson, the Israeli military spokesperson, what happens if one of these Scuds contains biological weapons, anthrax or whatever? And without a moment's hesitation, the officer said, it's quite simple, we would turn Baghdad into a sheet of glass, And it was a very chilling remark, I'm not suggesting for a moment that it's absolute proof and evidence that Israel has the bomb.
Could I interject?
I think it probably has.
In fact, Shimon Peres has admitted that Israel has the bomb, and he's written and spoken about his involvement in 1956 with the French, who enabled Israel in exchange for the Suez invasion of 1956 to get the bombs. I mean, it's pretty well documented and admitted now.
It's well documented, but it's an area that a journalist daren't inside Israel address almost. If we were talking about restrictions on reporting in Israel itself, that's one story that you poke your nose into it at great, great risk. As for Mordecai Vanunu, I mean, I don't know precisely where he is at the moment, but The last time I saw him, he was sitting in front of his laptop in the Jerusalem Hotel, which was one of the few sanctuaries that he seems to have at the moment.
He's living at St. George.
He's living at St. George, yeah. He moves between there. Just
technically, he's not allowed to speak to journalists. He's not allowed to go anywhere.
Or leave the country, obviously.
He's basically under house arrest. This is a man who spent 19 years in solitary confinement, which is something that they've never even done to an Arab prisoner. The gentleman at the back.
Nick Robertson from CNN. What's your assessment of the Saudi efforts at mediation between Fatah and Hamas?
Vested interest, in a nutshell. I think Saudi's involvement, you're presumably talking about the Arab Summit and resurrecting, the previous sort of proposals that they had, I think, around 2002. Yeah. I think this has got more to do with the machinations of the Sunni-Shia debate at the moment and the whole regional power brokering that's going on. Saudi, I would suspect, is keen to harness or rein in any influence that Iran might have in that way. It has to be seen to be starting to flex its muscles, take the initiative, if only to counter what Iran is actually doing. Whether it will come to anything, I doubt very much at the moment. There seems to be yet more empty rhetoric already coming out. It's very difficult to see how any initiative, any summit, even one initiated by Riyadh or by the Arabs themselves, can actually make much progress at the moment, given the current sort of climate across the Middle East.
It was a question from the front for David C. Bryant.
David C. Bryant, good evening. Firstly, I was interested in your opening remark about the new generation and young generation interested, because I was astonished to find how youthful the average age of people here are. Well, that's just an observation. But judging from your question, that you seem to accept the right of Israel to exist. Personally, I find this, as someone it didn't exist when I was born. I don't accept its right to exist, certainly not its present form. And I don't know why it's so unacceptable to believe this, because no one accepted the right of the Soviet Union to exist in the West in the form that it existed. And I think what we need to do is really question the right of Israel to exist. It's absolutely outrageous that any Jew from anywhere in the world can suddenly arrive in this country and live there. And hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, and I've seen their title deeds in refugee camps in Lebanon, have no right at all to return. The problem will never be solved until there is a solution. It's a one-state solution, and they all live in that country together. The two-state solution is rubbish.
Do you want to ask a question at all? No.
Well, the question would be, would you agree with me?
I have mixed feelings about the one-state solution, but I think you're absolutely right. And I think also that the big questions of Israel's legitimacy, its right to exist, international law, these things have all now been just sort of shoved aside. They've been put on the back burner. No one really questions them, I think, with any sort of forcefulness or veracity these days. And it's high time, I think, that happened again. There's no question about that. For me personally, I'm still, the jury's out for me personally with regards to the idea of a one-state solution. I'm yet to be convinced by that. I think it has to do with simply my observation of the situation on the ground at the moment. It seems to me to be slightly, dare I say it, an unfortunate pun, but off the wall. It's kind of cloud cuckoo land, thinking the idea that somehow these two peoples at this particular juncture, and indeed in the immediate future, are likely to just suddenly sit down and think in terms of a one-state solution. As I said earlier, I mean, Europe's got one view on it, Palestinians have got one view on it, Israel has one, the ordinary Israelis have a different view on it. We're a long way off from that at the moment, I think.
You could have some examples. No one in 1940s France could have conceived of the way that the European Union would develop. And in Northern Ireland, I think you have a perfect example of how these things can solve themselves. Outside factors, economic factors. And Ireland could well be a United State within, my lifetime, hopefully.
I think part of the problem is that, you can draw parallels, obviously, but one of the great difficulties is that, whenever you've worked in the Middle East for any length of time, it is difficult to be optimistic in that way. And if anything, I'm extremely pessimistic at the moment. I said that a few months ago when I was here in the club. And speaking to a number of Palestinians, they are also, for the reasons that, we've discussed this evening. Lack of leadership, lack of clarity, lack of inspiration, lack of an agenda, if you like, a clear, thought-through, pragmatic agenda. I think we're a long way off from that.
It's worth pointing out that the concept of a right to exist does not exist in international law. States recognize states. The United States in 1933 recognized the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union recognized the United States. There's never been in history a case of a state demanding that its right to exist be recognized. Just the fact of its existence is enough under international law.
Montevideo Convention, if I remember correctly, 1930s.
So the question at the back.
Yeah, I'm Maziar Bahari. I do documentary films.
I couldn't understand you. I'm sorry.
I'm Maziar Bahari. My name is difficult to understand, anyways, and I do documentaries for News and Newsnight. I was wondering about the influence of Iran on Hamas, because I was in Iran at the time of the execution of Saddam Hussein. And Iranians were not happy that Palestinians mourned Saddam Hussein's execution. And I was in Iraq last week, and many Shias I spoke with, they were not happy that no Palestinian faction condemned the killing of Shias in the beginning of the invasion in Iraq, like since last year. So I was wondering, what do you think about the influence of Iran on Hamas? Do you think it's exaggerated? Do you think it's just an opportunistic?
Personally, I think it is exaggerated somewhat. I think in physical terms, if you're talking about sort of supplies, logistical support, finance, money, I'm sure it exists. It does go on, but I do think that it is exaggerated to that extent. With regards to Saddam Hussein, I mentioned 1991. I do remember, standing on rooftops with Palestinians while they were banging their pots and pans and celebrating, the Al-Husseinis, the Scud missiles that the Iraqis were sending into Tel Aviv, And I do remember actually sitting in a cafe in the old city in East Jerusalem and, talking to Palestinians who said, right cause, wrong man, Saddam Hussein, we've been so bludgeoned for so long that anyone who has a pop at Israel in our eyes is a good guy. But that doesn't mean to say that we're fully committed and signed up to his vision of the Middle East or of the way the world operates. And I think if you ask a lot of Palestinians that, you will find that they're not they don't give him quite the heroic status that it is often claimed. There are elements, of course, who would see him as a fantastic hero and martyr. But I don't think it's as widespread as one would imagine. Iran's influence on Hamas, considerable but exaggerated. I think the considerable is definitely logistical support. There is no way the evidence of weaponry, of material coming in to Gaza, the origins of which would be an Iranian source, I think are indisputable. There's no question about that. The quota, the level of it, of course, is difficult to ascertain. But most commentators, analysts, observers will say that it's considerable but exaggerated. If we were to listen to Washington, it would be like there was this fantastic conduit of convoy of weaponry making its way from Tehran or Damascus to straight into the Gaza Strip. It's difficult enough getting food and water in and out the Gaza Strip, never mind weapons at the moment. I think it was the World Food Programme in the last week or so have actually made an assessment that says something like 70 or 80% of Gazans are actually in need of food security. That is absolutely outrageous when you consider there's absolutely no need for that whatsoever.
I'm sorry.
One more question. I find it difficult to be very sympathetic to cultures and countries that don't want to, at some stage in their evolution, accept a democratic and free political system, freedom for women, for gays, for journalists, for the kind of freedom we have here. And so while it's easy to be sympathetic to Palestinians given the context, it's difficult to be, I think, universally sympathetic. Do you think that any of the Arab countries in the next 400 years would ever voluntarily choose democracy and the freedoms that allow us to do what we're doing
But
here?
as I said earlier, they have tried democracy as we know it. I mean, the elections in Palestine were internationally monitored, deemed free, fair, and run along democratic lines. The only... Well...
for women's right to be under burqas and walk behind men. I mean, I'm a feminist. I cannot accept that Hamas is in any way going to create freedom for us, for them, for anybody. Yes, they democratically voted for Hamas, but as you say, it was a revengeful reaction to Fatah and other situations. My question is, why in 60 years have the Palestinians not, despite their obvious victimhood, gone past that philosophically, culturally, politically? Why haven't these countries been able to do that? And we're talking about Palestine.
If you're talking about the Palestinians themselves, I can answer in one word: occupation. You know that. I mean, it is true. I mean, whether you like it or not, it is the occupation. You know, you cannot develop culturally. You cannot make progress and step up to the mark if you are constantly being bludgeoned and not given the opportunity to do so. And that becomes even more compounded when, of course, admittedly, their own leaders, as I've said time and again this evening, are culpable in that respect as well. But to talk about democracy, about, you know, the Palestinians, they've tried everything here, you know.
Despite all
maybe too big tonight. Could I have another question?
Jewish religious law.
Which one?
This
Hey, Mike Dodds. I used to be a cameraman. I used to be a filmmaker. Luckily, I'm retired and looking back on my history. My first job was in Jerusalem, 1967, the Arab-Israeli War. And when we left Jerusalem, they had won the old city, and the Israeli sappers were bulldozing down the Arab houses, which just happened to be resting against the Western Wall. And my crew and my reporter, who was Lou Gardner, who was a very famous reporter at that time, said, "What is this meaning?" And I thought, well, I'm going to hang around and see what these guys do. And in fact, what they were doing, they were bulldozing the Arab houses. They then went on towards the West Bank, towards the Allenby Bridge, with their bulldozers and their machines to actually create a tarmac road towards Jordan. And I thought, this is great. This actually shows some progress. A, that they're progressing into Jordan, but also there's a slight worry about what all these buildings were being bulldozed down for. Now, 40 years on, I've been there back many, many times, and I'm still up against this wall. Nothing has actually happened. We've progressed about 1 centimeter this way. We've got now 200, 300, 4,000 or whatever it is, Israeli settlements in the West Bank, and yet journalists like ourselves have got no solutions. No government can be persuaded by the press. No government can be persuaded by any individual what the solution could be. And I think it's up to all of these people in this room who've got some idea how to formulate what's going to happen. Are the actual Palestinians allowed to be back into Israel? I don't think that's a goer, because now that lovely area where the Palestinian had a farm is now a supermarket. What do we do to actually make a solution, and what are the solution alternatives?
Firstly, I don't think it's the job of journalists to provide solutions, really. That would be my immediate reaction to that. But I also take your point that, you know, if there has been progress, it's been in many respects backwards. There's a lot of changes been made. One only has to go and have a look at that massive wall that runs for hundreds of kilometres to realise there have been a lot of changes there for the bad if you're Palestinian, and indeed if you're Israeli, because, you know, it's far from ideal to live and exist in a situation where you need or feel the need to have a barrier or a wall like that. I mean, I think it was Nick's question earlier on about the Saudi initiative. You know, the thorny issues remain: the right to return, the status of Jerusalem. No one has actually really come up with any solutions to these issues at the moment, and it's hard to imagine that this new initiative will address them any more effectively than they have in the past. I personally believe that Israel will never compromise on Jerusalem, on the status of Jerusalem. And if you look and visit and talk to East Jerusalemites, particularly at the moment, or those within the environs of Jerusalem, the sense of suffocation over the last few years has grown tangibly. Jerusalem is being cut off, it is being strangled. That in itself is an indication of what Israel intends with regards to Jerusalem, the city, as a potential capital of a Palestinian state. It's not going to happen. As for the right of return, well, the demographics alone of the region make it quite clear that a massive return of Palestinian refugees from Lebanon or Jordan or wherever would be something that the Israelis really couldn't comprehend or live with. So it's hard to see how progress can be made on those particular issues. And I'm not sure that the summit in Riyadh will add anything particularly new to that. It has to come from inside the Palestinian movement. Something has to change there, and I do believe that.
There were discussions at Taba in September 2000, and subsequently in Geneva, in which most of these things were hashed out very well between Israeli liberals and Palestinian liberals. Indeed. And that if that could be made acceptable to the Israeli establishment, to the Israeli electorate, then there could be progress, because there is a template for a solution there, but it's not going to be accepted yet. No one is lobbying hard enough to make it accepted. The United States is certainly not going to push Israel in that direction.
I think you're right. I think the template exists. I think it was Amos Oz, actually, and who was, indeed, and a number of other Israelis, David Grossman, people who've been involved in that sort of process, working slowly behind the scenes in Geneva and elsewhere to try and make some. And there was progress being made, but that template, you're right. I mean, Ariel Sharon may be out of the frame, so to speak, now, but there's absolutely no way that the Israeli establishment will take that on board. And it is that grasping the nettle and chipping constantly away at these very, very seemingly intractable issues that will only allow progress to be made. I don't believe there is the leadership on either side to help that happen. Israel doesn't want to take on board that template. And frankly, there are very few within the Palestinian community who are able to help push that template as well.
I think we have time for one more question, and then David is going to be selling and signing his book here at the table. So I want you all to know that the books are there. They're paperbacks. They're not expensive. So I'll take one final question, you think.
Yeah, I was wondering about these secret talks between some Israelis and Syrians. Do you think that Syrians are serious about a peace deal with Israel? Or do you think they like this war of attrition go on for their own legitimacy? And don't you think that the worst thing that the Israelis can do for this Syrian government is just to give back Golan Heights, and then the regime will really have nothing to say to its public?
I think Syria at the moment is actually certainly since the war last year in Lebanon as well. I mean, that showed it's in a pivotal position in that way. I don't think that it really is that committed to these talks with Israel. I think that the differences are still so massive that it's impossible to see Syria and Israel really having any serious dialogue. As for the Golan Heights, it's a bit like our intractable issues a moment ago. I mean, I just can't see that changing either.
As I understand it from some Israeli diplomats, that Israel and Syria very much wanted to go forward with this, but the United States told the Israelis not to do it.
Absolutely. Again, it's the United States influence that is paramount here. You know, the region is constantly at the beck call of Washington. The leverage that it has, the lobbies that we spoke about earlier on, are so massive. There are, I think, within Lebanon, within Beirut, within Damascus, within the countries within the region, there is the potential for that talking. It's undoubtedly there, and talks do go on behind the scenes. We're again, the last time I was here, I mean, we were given a small glimmer into what was going on from one of the representatives of Fatah here. These things are always ongoing. We're never, as generally as the public, aware of the machinations and the detail of them. But I think whenever any progress is being made, it's quite simply that there is, if you like, a universal agenda from Washington at the moment. We're talking about this proxy war that's going on, this need to fight Islamofascism, this need to back various militias, groups, anyone who will do the bidding of Washington. As long as that prevails, it's difficult to see how any progress in Damascus or anywhere else is likely to be made.
So I want to thank David Pratt on behalf of the Frontline Club for coming this evening and discussing his book. It's been fascinating for me, having read the book, and I think probably for you as well. So thank you very much, David.